The hardening of Pharaoh's heart. It is a very, very famous subject in the Bible. It's something that Paul takes up again in the New Testament, and it's something that many believers struggle with. My goal in going through the Hebrew today is not to argue for a Calvinist or an Arminian position, but rather to simply say, what does the text say? And are our English translations often not sufficiently sensitive to what the text says? Now, before I get into any of this, let me say that from a biblical perspective, the pottery, the clay, has no right to tell the potter what to do. God can do what he wants to do because he is God. God can have mercy on whom he wants to have mercy. He can harden whom he wants to harden. And it's not up to us to find fault with him because we are the clay and he is the potter. So, as a believer in the one true God, the God of the universe, the creator, I bow before him and I recognize that any sense of morality and justice that I have comes from being created in his image. I simply want to say, what does the text say and how can we best understand it? All right? There's also the question of how God hardens a heart. It's been pointed out through the centuries that the same rays of sun that bake the clay melt the wax. So God can reveal his love to someone and they don't want to hear it and it hardens their heart. Have you ever shared the gospel with someone that told you they're not interested, and the more you talk to them, the further you drive them away? So there are many different ways that God can harden a heart as well. We bow before him as the king who can do whatever he pleases. We also know that whatever he does is ultimately good and just, even if we don't always see it like that from our vantage point. So here's the first verse of interest, and I've got my nice little Hebrew Bible here. The first verse of interest we find is in Exodus chapter 3, verse 19. Now, it doesn't mention the word harden yet, but when God is sending Moses to Pharaoh, and of course Moses goes reluctantly and only with Aaron's help, when God's sending Moses to Pharaoh to have his people leave Egypt, to give the mandate to Pharaoh, let my people go, God says, and I know that he will not let you go. The king of Egypt will not let you go, even biyad chazakah, even with a strong hand. In other words, even with God putting pressure on him and working miracles, he said, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go. So that's the first thing that's actually spoken. So that's Exodus 3:19. When we get to Exodus chapter 4, verse 21, this is the first time now, and again, this is before they've gotten to Egypt. This is the first time we have a reference to the hardening of the heart. And God says this, Vani achazek et libo. The verb chazak means to be strong. That's the basic meaning of that verb, chazak, to be strong. In this form, which is called the PL or an intensive form, lichazek, means to make strong. Now, virtually every time you'll see this verse or this verb in this form used in the Hebrew Bible, you'll see that it means to make firm, to make strong. So rather than translate this as harden, at the least translate it as stiffen. But you could say, I will make his heart firm. In other words, he doesn't want to let you go, and I'm going to strengthen his resolve not to let you go. Now, how could God do that? In 1,000 different ways. And he's sovereign, and let God be God. I'm simply opening up what the Hebrew says. I know that this is commonly translated harden, but you'll see there are 3 different verbs, and they're also used in different forms. I think we need to distinguish between them in our translations. So I will literally strengthen his heart so that he won't let you go. Now, in chapter 5, verse 4, that's the first time now when Pharaoh is given an edict, he says no. No, it doesn't mention harden there, but he plainly says no. He sets the pace, he sets the tone. He's a wicked man, he's a hard-hearted man. Romans 9 repeats what's written in Exodus 9, God saying, for this reason I raised you up, or I allowed you to live, that my glory might be seen throughout the whole land. He was a sinful man, and in that sense, he was the right man for this job of resisting God. Now, chapter 7, verse 3, chapter 7, verse 3 is a very important verse. Here, God says, Va'ani akshe et lev paro. I will harden. The root kasha means to be hard. Other aspects of it, to make hard. Here in this form called the hifil, or the causative, it is to make hard. I will make his heart hard. I will make his heart hard. It's the same as we have in Psalm 95, where God says to the children of Israel, don't harden your hearts. So harden is absolutely the right way to translate it here, and God says he'll do that. Now, this is the one primary time that this verb, and especially in this form, occurs in the entire narrative. So now we go to chapter 7, verse 13. Chapter 7, verse 13. And Pharaoh refuses to let the people of Israel go. And what does it say? V'yechzak lev paro. His heart was strong. That's literally what it says. Not hard, but strong. He was firm in his resolve. And then the very next verse, chapter 7, verse 14, God says this, as he is describing Pharaoh's heart, his heart is kaved, which literally means heavy. The root kavad means heavy, weighty. We get from that the word kavod, speaking of God's glory. But it can refer to the liver in the Bible as the heaviest organ. All right, so kaved, his heart is heavy. In other words, it's thick and it's resistant. But God is simply describing it. He's not actually doing anything to him at this point. Chapter 7, verse 22 is exactly the same as 7:13. Once again, Pharaoh's heart is stiff, it is firm. His resolve to say no remains firm. Now, notice we have not had God do anything actively yet. He's just describing Pharaoh's heart is stiff, Pharaoh's heart is strong, Pharaoh's heart is heavy. Okay? Then chapter 8, verse 15, in Hebrew it's verse 11. So if you're able to look that up, you'll see there's a discrepancy of 4 verses in the numbering. We have all the same text, but the numbering is different. So 8:15 or 8:11 in the Hebrew, what does it say? That when Pharaoh just sees there's a respite, okay, there's a little bit of a break here. What does it say? V'hachbed et libo, and he made his heart heavy. This is what he did. Pharaoh makes his own heart heavy, and he won't listen to them. So his heart is heavy, thick, and it's resolved. And now he makes it harder. He makes it heavier. This, again, is what Pharaoh is doing. And then if we go down to verse 23 or verse 19 in the Hebrew, that's the exact same thing as we had earlier in chapter 7, where his heart is strong, firm in its resolve. And then chapter 8, verse 32 or verse 28 in Hebrew, and it says again, V'yachbed paro et libo, and he made his heart thick. He made his heart heavy. Now, the first thing you've got to see here is that over and over and over, Pharaoh is taking action. Pharaoh is saying no. Pharaoh is strengthening his resolve. Pharaoh is firming up his own heart. Pharaoh is more and more determined. And the moment he has a break, the moment he has a respite, I don't need to repent. I don't need to humble myself. And as a result, again, I want you to see God first said he will say no. He won't let you go. And then God says, I'm going to strengthen his resolve, and I'm going to harden his heart. And then repeatedly, Pharaoh says, no, 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 no. His heart is strong. His heart is firm. His heart is heavy. He makes his heart firm and heavy and strong. This is what we see happening so far. And it's not until this next chapter, the 9th chapter, that we actually see God himself now beginning to take action, which is giving Pharaoh over to his sin. Again, pointing out that over and over and over, Pharaoh makes his resolve strong. He says no. He strengthens his own heart. He makes his own heart heavy. The verb for to make hard has only been used once. God said he would do that earlier. It hasn't come up now again in the text. Chapter 9, verse 7, again speaking of Pharaoh, vayichbad. Vayichbad, his heart was heavy. Then chapter 9, verse 12 is the first time in this narrative, once it's unfolding, that God now takes the initiative. And what verb is used? Vayichazek. God firms up his resolve. God strengthens his resolve. At the least, translate with stiffen rather than harden. But I would rather say that God strengthened his resolve not to let the people go. The point being, this is not a man saying, God, I recognize my sin, have mercy. God, I'm guilty. I'm a hard-hearted sinner. I need help. I need mercy. God, spare me. And God says, no way. No, this is a hard-hearted sinner, and God is giving him over to his sin. This is an unrepentant, proud man, and God says, I am going to give you over to that. You want to sin? I'm going to strengthen your resolve to sin. You want to resist? I'm going to make your resistance even harder. That's what's happening. Again, God can do what he chooses to do, but what he does is also consistent with his nature and consistent with principles of we reap what we sow. Once again, chapter 9, verse 34, Pharaoh, vayichbad. The same thing. His heart is heavy. Not hard, but heavy. Just as we saw in chapter 9, verse 7. And then chapter 9, verse 35, vayechzak. Vayechzak. What is that? Again, his heart is strong. His heart is firm. Now, chapter 10, verse 1, as we come to the culmination here, Vihichbadati, and I will make his heart heavy, God says. And then chapter 10, verse 27, Vayichazek, and God strengthened Pharaoh's resolve. Chapter 11, verse 10, same thing. So after Pharaoh's repeated sin, no, I won't repent, I won't humble myself, over and over, then what happens? Then God begins to get involved in a more active way and give him over to his sin and strengthen his resolve to sin and make his heart even heavier. You want to sin? I'm going to help you to sin. You want to resist? I'm going to help you resist. You want to stand up against God? I'm going to help you stand up against God. You're going to die for it. So when we get to chapter 14, as Pharaoh and his servants decide they're going to go after the Israelites, hey, how in the world do we let them go? What? Look, I have been with people. One man in particular I'm thinking of so tragically that I had to confront him over committing adultery. He took off with some gal, married man, took off with some gal. I had to be the one to confront him, a close friend, fellow worker, and he was weeping and broken. The next day I brought him to meet with a leader so that we could talk about a plan for him to step down from leading the church and to get through a place of restoration and how we'd find a way to pay his salary during this time and over the course of a year, try to get him on a path of restoration. And it was clear he wanted nothing to do with it. By the next day, he was plotting how to keep that church and how to divide the people and so on. In other words, he got caught, but he wasn't repentant. And once he had a little break, the tears weren't there anymore. You could tell something was different. Pharaoh gets a break, and now God says, oh yeah, your heart's still wicked and hard. I'm going to make it even harder. So, chapter 14, verse 4, God says, V'hichakti, I will strengthen. That's what it is. I will strengthen his resolve. And then 14:8, same thing. V'yichazek, and God strengthens his resolve. 14:17, same thing. Michazek, God strengthens Pharaoh's resolve. And of course, he goes to follow the children of Israel as they go through the Red Sea, and he and his soldiers die in the process. Look, throughout the Bible, we are urged not to harden our hearts. Psalm 95:8 in Hebrew, do not harden your heart, do not make them hard. That's repeated in Hebrews chapter 3:8, 3:13, 3:15, 4:7. Don't harden your hearts. We're told not to do that. We're told don't harden your heart. That is our responsibility. What's written in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 1? The person who hardens his heart, that same verb that we found in Psalm 95 and that God uses once in the Exodus account in the 7th chapter. The one who constantly hardens his heart after being rebuked many times will suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. So the best thing that we can learn from the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, yes, God is sovereign and can do what he wants. And the clay, the pottery, has no right to tell the potter, the master builder, the creator, what to do and what's right and what's wrong. We don't get to lecture God on what's right and what's wrong. Nonetheless, everything he does is right and good. God never sins. God never does evil. Because God is God doesn't mean he gets away with evil. No, everything he does is perfect light and perfect goodness and perfect justice. Calvinist and Arminian would agree on that. And we all must agree that we bow down before him as sovereign God and King. But the Exodus account is not talking about, say, taking somebody like Abraham and saying, I'm going to harden your heart so that you end up sinning against me and dying in your sin. No, God has mercy as people humble themselves before him and cry out for mercy. He gives grace to the humble. But what does it say? He resists the proud. And one way that he resists the proud is by giving the proud over to their pride, by giving them over to their sin. These are insights from the Hebrew Scriptures. I trust you'll find them helpful.